the keywords today. We have two kind of rich keywords for this novel, and there'll be ones that are great for the course too and for your papers. So I hope that we can get something out of them, and they'll remain with you a little bit. One is violence, one is child, and I want to start with violence. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Thank you. Start with violence. Keyword. So this is actually a word that I have kind of been interested in. I taught at actually a graduate seminar where we read a lot of stuff about violence. It's been something, I think maybe since 9/11, it's been something that has been, a lot of people have written about, thought about what is violence. And so the key word, and the reason, part of the reason I kind of picked up on it, it's only because I saw the word around a lot, but also because obviously crime fiction has a relationship to violence of one, somehow, which is funny in a way because it's often, it can be very violent, but it often can be, there's violence is far from it in a sense because it's convention bound, right? This idea that the kind of finding out about violence doesn't mean necessarily depicting it, even if there isn't necessarily a crime somehow that gets investigated. But anyway, those are just some thoughts about violence. Let me just start by asking, what is it? And then I can kind of tell you a little bit more about some perspectives. And I want to say here, the question is, one of the interesting questions with this novel, and the reason I chose this keyword for it, is this a violent novel? Is it a novel about violence? So I'll just leave that as a rhetorical question for now, but you can keep it in the back of your mind as we talk about the term. And we'll start. So let me just hear what people think. What is violence? Yeah.
The act of harming.
Okay, act of harming. So that is a good start. There's some kind of harm visited upon someone. Now, one question would be, what if I or someone says something horrible to you? It doesn't harm you physically. Is that a violent act? Mental harm? Like, what's the line? Where does it... I don't have an answer to the question, but it's certainly one that comes up, right? What is the violent act? Is it an act, right? Or can a system be violent, right? Can there be kind of an objective violence that's depersonalized? Other thoughts? Yeah. Is it Peter?
Yeah. I think it's an act of violence if a person who's the victim feels a sense of unwarranted other people. He doesn't like what's happening.
Okay, so the victim's sense of violation is important. That
because I could, like, if I was with, for instance, with my friend and I hit him as like a joke, and if he didn't hurt, I don't consider that an act of violence.
right.
If it's something that he feels like it's not what he wanted, I feel like that's.
Okay, so that's about how should I put it? Common to put context. That's maybe a neutral way to put it. The context matters when we speak about violence. Charlie.
Violence is like an act of displaying power over someone.
Okay, so power is another aspect there. What's interesting, to think about that. What maybe you could say? You say display power. You want to tell us what you mean by that?
Controlling, domineering.
Okay.
As opposed to you have the power to instruct this classroom and lead it in some sort of direction, but we.
Maybe that's a kind of violence. People say that. People say teaching is a kind of violence, right? Because you come in the room with one set of ideas, and I'm trying to change you here, so that you come out the other end with another set of ideas, or that people say, do you want that? It's against your will, right? Perhaps. But yeah, no, there's a voluntary aspect, right? But yeah.
Come into this classroom and you have the power to guide us in a direction, but we also have the power to if this is something we want to talk about that you don't necessarily had in the lesson plan.
Yeah.
The conversation is probably going to go that way at least a little.
Yeah. Right. So this is a great point here, and this actually bears on the novel as well. And so I think Charlie has raised 2 points here. One is what violence is, that it's about control. And what I want to say is, one of the reasons it seems like kind of weird to say, oh, well, teaching is a kind of violence, is this a violent situation here, is that violence as a term has a negative connotation. Right? When we talk about violence, there's somehow there's like a negative stigma attached to it, right? And the reason I raise that is that when you think of like me up here, or even like the police, say, just doing their job, we tend not to think of that as violence because it's cloaked in institutional authority, right? And so people have pointed out, well, these are actually forms of violence, but because they have this kind of institutional stamp on them, we don't think of them as violence, right? But they were put there by, some choices at some point, and they have a big effect on, they shape the way people are, say, against your will, perhaps. There's all kinds of criticisms of the university out there and what it does to people. That it's a kind of violence. So that violence, it's also that there's that like stigma in talking about it. So when I say I'm teaching, you say I'm doing violence, right? They're different reads of the same kind of action. And so then this bears in a novel, right? Because what's an innocent action? What's a violent action? The section for today, right? We read these kind of interviews with both the perspective of the perpetrator in the novel. We have two chapters from that perspective where he's reflecting on sort of what he did and what his sort of sexual predilections, what watching children, and then they interview this kind of like hail good fellow pedophile, right, who is talking about going to the park and sitting and watching children. And right there, that's that issue. Are those violent acts to have those thoughts, that imply a kind of a harm? Or are those not violent acts? Right? This is a moral question that arises in the novel. So this issue of violence is a way of kind of trying to tackle some of the moral issues that the novel wants to bring up. And so the question is that one of the things, talking about Charlie, is that sometimes violence, you could say, is the word we use to talk about bad things being done by people who aren't in power, right? It's violent if I slug a cop, right? And I'm going to get arrested. But if the police slug me, they're trying to subdue the situation, and there's rules that they're following and so forth and so on, right? It's ostensibly not violence, right? And so in a way, like, violence is this kind of thing that is, it's the people who don't have power that use violence, and that's in a way why it has this kind of negative charge. That's just one way of thinking about it. Not necessarily, you don't have to take that. I'm not saying that's the way it is, but that's one way. Is that when institutions are violent, right, we don't call it violence. We call it order, right, or the capitalist system or whatever. But when we call something violent, we're saying that's an unacceptable behavior. If a child is violent, it's an unacceptable behavior, right? We're scolding and saying that you shouldn't do that. So violence can mean different things coming from different perspectives. Jennifer, you've been waiting with your hand up.
To me, violence, the notion that it brings about is the physical force.
Okay.
Not just against people, but also against property.
Okay. People and property. So that emphasis on the physicality of violence is very important. One thing we haven't talked on is where does violence come from? Yeah.
It's like associated with anger a lot.
Okay, so anger and emotion, like some kind of sense of uncontrollable, right? Yeah, Tulupe? Tapule. My God. I was so proud of myself. I'm like, I got it. Bam.
Sometimes they said it stemmed from like childhood kind of things. So like
okay. Childhood experience. Right. People are probably familiar with these kinds of arguments that kids maybe are exposed to violence in the home at a young age and think that that's okay, and then use violence in interpersonal situations as they grow older, and then get in trouble with, say, the law or whatever, because they cross legal lines in their use of violence. So that childhood experience can be important. Obviously, that's a theme here too. thinking about, there's a lot of comment on these abusers have suffered themselves, hence their actions. They were the victims of violence as young people, and as a result, they commit violence. Other thoughts about where it comes from? Yeah.
Like video games?
Video games, yeah. So, right, this is the idea, right? Kind of mimetic violence. That is, think about it, mimetic, it's a Greek word, but you hear it in imitate, right? You play first-person shooter games, and you feel comfortable in slotting into that role of first-person shooter, and as a result, you're inclined in that direction, right? So that those are arguments about the way in which we consume culture. They train us in a certain way. Now, whether you buy that or don't buy that, obviously that's something that's been debated for a long time. I mean, it was the same with the movies when they first came out. That the movies are going to make you violent because they depict violence on the screen. That was, in fact, you may know, there was a code in Hollywood, the so-called Hays Code from the 30s to the late 50s, that said that Hollywood police itself had said that you can never show crime pays, right? And so violence had to be either not shown or shown to be, if there were any violence, it was very subtle, and then it had to be shown as having a great cost, right? So that, and why do they have that code? Because there was a lot of hand-wringing about how dangerous the movies were for us. Now we have, the rating system, which is still the self-policing of the film industry. So there's an old worry that the things we read and see and do, banned books, the things we read and see and do in culture shape our minds in ways that might incline us to violence. Hannah.
I think it comes from some kind of conflict, whether you're taking it out on someone or if it just arises from like a direct conflict between people and then you act.
Okay. Conflict leading to action. This is actually one of the things that I was going to point out here. Let me put it this way here. I'll contextualize what I was going to say. Okay, there's a couple of ways people think. One of it is that you could say there's biological causes to violence. This is like the ape argument, right? If you know there's a very famous professor of psychology, Steven Pinker. Maybe people know that name. He's written a lot of books and speaks a lot in public and writes editorials and so forth. And he has a book called The Better Angels of Our Desire from a couple years ago about violence. It's like a huge, big, fat book that, when you're a professor at Harvard, you have lots of research assistants who almost write the book for you. You just get the ideas. Long story short, the book is basically there's a strong biological argument there that he's committed this like cognitive idea of the self, which means that there's a hardwiring in the body that makes us who we are, and culture can kind of modify it a little bit. Basically, you're hardwired in certain ways. And so, in this way, it's like apes are violent, chimpanzees are violent, humans are violent. If you look at the history of human civilization, you can look back and find we were way, way, way more violent, according to the archaeological evidence that Pinker cites, than we are now. And what's happened along the way? That the state, basically, and kinds of forms of moral philosophy, is a very Western-centric argument, in the West, have shaped the way we think about violence, and they've controlled us. Right? We're no longer apes, we're civilized, and as a result, less violent. So that's his argument, basically, in that book. So that's the kind of biological argument, that we're inclined to violence, but we can be less violent. One of the things I'll just point out right here to think about here for our novel and thinking about novels in the course is violence easy? Is violence easy? Because that's the argument there. If you're biologically inclined to it, right? When you get angry, you can't control yourself. You feel like you're in a violent situation. You should be able to do it, right? But actually, if you've had violent experiences, whether really scary ones or more mundane ones, I bet you everyone knows that violence is actually really, really hard and really, really stressful, and it makes a deep impact on a person, right? To be in a violent situation. And that's another argument. on another perspective, which you could call the sort of the situational argument, I'll call it. And this is from the perspective of sociology. There's a really interesting sociologist who's written a lot about violence. His name is Randall Collins. And the thing he points out is that violence is, the really interesting question is, we all know people that we would say are more violent, maybe, or more inclined to violence than others. But are they usually violent? Have you ever seen them be violent? You know, very, very rarely. Even the most violent, they're very rarely violent, right? So what is it about, why? There must be something in the situation that makes people violent. And this is what his whole argument is that there are certain situations that lend themselves to violence. And it's kind of an ugly argument, because he says when people get violent is when someone turns and runs, right? Then people stab them in the back, basically. Shoot them in the back, right? And so he's got all this very, very elaborate argument that the whole thing then is about, we're so afraid of violence, it's so hard, it's so stressful, that you cannot act competently in a violent situation. So, for example, he goes through all this like observational evidence of like police shootings, right, where police professionals, right, trained to deal with violent situations. Oftentimes, you read in the paper, oh, the police shot him like 20 times, right, when he opened the door of the house that he was holding up in or whatever. And you ask yourself, well, why did they do that, right? Well, they're supposed to use overwhelming force or whatever. But his argument is that the police are panicked, right? It's such a stressful situation. It just builds up where there's these sorts of situations. And they kind of lose control in those violent situations. And when they finally see the weakness, it's just like full on, right? And that he calls it a forward panic, because the situation is so stressful. When the pathway opens, the force goes that way. Very interesting to think about too is that there's all these studies of soldiers in combat. For example, in World War II, points out about violence. Even in the most, like the bloodiest fighting in World War II, post-combat surveys of American soldiers found that what percent of the men fired their guns? You might wonder. Anyone know or heard these studies before? The SLAM studies are called. SLA Marshall was the general who conducted them. 15% of the soldiers fire their guns, right? So the argument about that is that there's a few people that are actually competent in combat and feel like they don't feel fear, or they're just like they're able to do that. But most people are just like they're cowering, they're terrified. These are trained soldiers, right? And so it's actually the exact opposite point of Pinker. That the thing that makes us violent is civilization. That's the way to overcome those feelings of tension and fear. So when we find ourselves in a violent situation, it's like, for professionals, it's better training to get over it that makes people competent to act in those situations. So his whole argument is that we're averse to violence. So this is kind of interesting to think about in the book. Like, what are the attitudes toward violence? Is this a novel about violence? Because it's so like on the edge. Thinking about abuse. So those are just a couple ways to think about violence. What I wanted to do was, you can look at the keyword. What I want to do is introduce the term and talk about a couple ways to think about it that might be relevant to our novel, and then we can pick that up in the discussion, thinking about a little bit more about violence. But people have already introduced some really great points about it, and I think that this is something that is going to be helpful to us when we turn to the discussion. Another thing to think about is about this theme of kind of like the child and pedophilia, to turn to our next term. There we see the same kinds of arguments. Where does that come from? That kind of violence. If we think of that as a kind of violence, where does that come from? Is it a biological thing? Is it a situational thing, like people have suffered abuse and become abusers? What does this novel have to say about those issues? That's obviously a central question that it wants to raise. So let's take a second here to turn to the child. That was our second keyword here today. And obviously a key issue for the novel. And let me dare to ask silly, stupid question. What's a child? Right. Well, take a minute, just talk about that, and get like one good answer to it with someone sitting or people sitting next to you. What's a child?
Actually, if you guys can keep that, I don't know. I think there is a pain like innocence around that. Okay. Well, first of all, how child are we talking? How there's something. But what age are we talking about? That's what I'm thinking about, right? So I'm thinking like, when I think of child, I'm thinking I think once they get like, maybe, I say, to begin with, they have to be selfish. They can't, like, you can't, they know nothing. Hence, what that is, ignorance and innocence.
Yeah, that's not like they're innocent.
It's because you have to put your needs first. I don't know. I don't know, man. My sense of child. I went to a lot of, at my church, I went to a lot of like, kindergarten, little girls. They're very, they just
Okay, let's hear what people have to say here. This is, as you can see, it's like got one of the questions for the midterm and the final, and this is something I've noticed in reading these novels and talking about them with students, that it's just like the child is like, I think I said this on the first day, it's just ever present, it seems like. And I think it's actually a quite interesting theme for a lot of reasons. And it's a hard question to answer, like, what's a child? We'll see, this novel actually does a good job, I would argue, at painting a pretty broad spectrum of features of the child. It's there's some ambivalence about what the child is here, no question about it. So let's take a stab at least some kind of like first principles or ideas here about what the child is. Gabrielle, you had your hand up first.
Like a person that hasn't been fully developed yet, like they haven't reached maturity.
Okay, a person. You didn't say immature. Immature person. Okay, and that can mean. So I'm just going to put here. We can maybe talk about this. What's maturity? Caitlin, what's that? Kendall.
I was just thinking, like, a person, like, most of the time hasn't experienced a loss of innocence.
Okay, so, hasn't experienced loss of innocence. So maturation is losing your innocence in a sense. Well, I mean, that can mean a lot of different things. All right, we'll keep working on it. Kaya.
Said under the age of 12.
Okay. Under the age of 12. Kind of scary. Give him the keys, right? Just thinking more. Yeah. I'm sorry, what's your name again?
Tao.
Tao, right.
I think Tao is like a blank paper.
Okay. The blank slate, right? That there's the child can almost be formed. Yeah. What's your name again? Marina.
They're always curious.
Okay. Curiosity. And almost Marina's point relates a little bit to Kendall's earlier point about innocence, that the curiosity seems to be connected somehow to the innocence. Right? You get older, right, and you realize you shouldn't be curious because there's things you don't want to know. Right?
Yes.
So, you don't ask that question, right? That's like a good lawyer. Don't ask that question because you might get something you don't want, right? You're wearing a hat today. I can't remember your name. Agnes, that's right.
I guess someone who is expected, who doesn't have as much responsibility.
Okay, so there's a sense of less responsibility. And you said expectation. But we certainly recognize that legally, that we don't hold children or kids or minors to the same legal standards as adults, right? Give the different courts for them, juvenile courts and so forth. So that's an important point here. In the back, Derek, yeah. I'm sorry, what? Okay. Protection or guidance. In some ways, that's like, right, that's the, Derek's point has to do with this immaturity, right? That because of the state, then the state of the child, they need some sort of guidance. Yeah, right in front of Derek. You, yeah. What's your name? Tommy.
Children are vulnerable.
Okay, vulnerable. Right, and this is obviously a big theme in this novel. Vulnerable in many different ways, right? Emotionally, physically, they're small people. Physically. Yeah. Austin?
Like an inability to fully care for themselves or be independent.
Okay, so I'm just going to add that inability to care, right? This is like you could say that's like the mammalian point, right? That they mature, human children mature slowly and they have big heads, right? And they can't take care of themselves for a long time. And so they need to be cared for, right? And so that's part of that, whether you want to say that physical or emotional, see that in all ways. Ben.
They have a lack of experience.
Okay, inexperienced. Good.
Someone who's easily manipulated.
Okay. Easily manipulated. That is, right, you can tell them things that will lead them to action that they might not recognize the consequences of. Right? Whether that's coercion, give me some of that ice cream, right? Or, more subtle. Cassie? Cassie.
Yeah. Reluctance to change.
Okay. You want to tell us? That's good. Tell me more.
Yeah. Children are very comfortable in their own environment, and new things while they're curious seems hard to accept.
So routine attached, is that an okay elaboration? That they like structure, right? They like to have the same things happen again, right? Anyone ever read stories of children? Just like the same thing. Read it over and over. I mean, like these kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah, talk about like easy persuade too. Kind of like when I put you about movies, like kids when they watch movies, like it's super into them, and like even though it's not realistic at all, they can get persuaded easy.
Okay, so let's say like credulous. That's a fancy word. I'm trying to actually, you know what? I'm going to share something with you that got on my mind because of something someone said in this class. I can't remember who. I'm sorry to do this, but you can help me here. You can help me. The first day, someone said, "Oh yeah, I rate my professor," and it sounded good. So then for some reason, I was looking for something in my web stuff or finding something where my name is, and that was the very top thing on Google. So I just clicked it. And see, I'm still a child, right? I shouldn't do that because I know that I don't want to see that, but my childish side got control. And then the first comment was like, "It's an okay class. The professor uses a lot of filler words." And I was asking myself, what are filler words? And I thought that meant like I said and like that kind of thing, which I've really tried over the years to not do, because that's just good public speaking, to try to say what you mean without getting hung up in lots of ums and whatever. Maybe that's the problem. But then I was having dinner with some friends, and I told them about this, and then I think I said some long word, and they just started laughing like, "That's a filler word." And I realized, and I think the criticism is that maybe I tend to use fancy words when I should use clear language, and so I'm trying to think about that to try to find the right way to speak, because it can be a very irritating habit for the professor, right, who wants to use fancy language to impress you with how much he or she knows about language or about what they're talking about. So you're welcome to share with me if you think that that's my problem using filler words like that. But it is something. Right? There's two views. I'm just going to say one super quick thing. There's two views, right? You come to college to develop your thinking skills, and part of that is broadening your vocabulary. And so it's my responsibility to challenge you with the right words and words that hit on exactly what we're trying to talk about. And I can't always do that, but I continue to try to do that. And in that way, we enrich our own learning by pushing the envelope a little bit. By contrast, you can say, my responsibility is to work with you as clearly as possible so you can hone your thinking. And that's not about language. In fact, oftentimes that's about getting rid of the big words to get to the clarity and the heart of the matter. So you can see there's different ways of thinking about it, but that's my little discourse on filler words for the moment. Okay, but credulous just means, right, we're just trying to, the kid is vulnerable to being led, and easily believes. In the back.
They're unaware.
Unaware. Okay, so that's a little bit like inexperienced, maybe. Unaware. Right here. What's your name again? Kate, right.
Carefree, because they aren't jaded yet.
Okay, so because of the innocence, maybe carefree, unaware of the consequences, haven't had experience with consequences. Gabrielle? Small. You mean physically? Yeah. They're small people. Right? Yeah. Elizabeth?
They're
Imaginative. Very good. And that can be tied up in all these things. James?
Playful.
Playful. Very good. And Johnny?
They need extra love and attention.
Okay, extra. They need extra love and attention, and sometimes crave that. So here's some thoughts about the child. The child right away. I think it's just helpful to build almost like a word cloud like this, or like when you see on some websites where they show the word searches that get connected. And there's one that's really big and one that's smaller and so forth. But we can definitely see this idea of inexperience, naivete, vulnerability. These are all things. One thing that people didn't say that's come up when I've had this conversation before is mean-spirited, violent, animalistic. Caitlin?
Well, one thing I would add that actually didn't really make it to the list that's pretty typical of kids, especially the younger they are, is they tend to really see the world as centered around themselves.
Okay.
Not necessarily like in a really selfish, petty way or anything like that, but they tend to have their worldview is pretty tight-knit around what's around.
Yeah. Right there, it's like it's about them. Right? Tal?
The answer to that is spoiled.
Spoiled? Right. Yeah, they expect things to be delivered for them, right? Austin? What's that? Moody? Yeah, actually, if you work with kids or you have a lot of experience with kids or you have kids of your own, you'll know right away what that means. And what's the thing that makes them moody more than anything else? Food! When they get hungry, they're just horrible. Right? And when they've eaten, they're like as happy as can be. Those little bodies are like, wah, right? Because it doesn't take much. But yeah, they're very moody. They're very self-centered. They can be they're mean. They're violent. Right? If you have siblings, you know that. And these are things that, and it's not just like kind of casual, sort of like, oops. They're like out to hurt each other oftentimes. Yeah. Impulsive. Yeah, so that this is the thing we've had maybe the way I asked the question, we've been kind of putting the innocence spin on it. But there's it's like Lord of the Flies, right? It's a war. Kids are at war with each other. Right? And this is something to think about here too, because this is part of the novel as well. If you haven't read to the end. Right? So it's worth thinking about, and then how can you understand the relationship between kids who are evil, right, and kids who are innocent? What is that connection? That's a rhetorical question. Yeah. We can take it up as we talk about the novel. Jennifer, you look like you have something to add there too.
Yeah, for me, kids, they don't know the difference between right or wrong. So I think that their intentions, most of the time, are kind of pure-minded.
Pure-minded. Okay. Morally vague, so pure. minded. That's maybe part of the point. I'm sorry, in the back, what was your name again? Michael, right? That Michael made about they're easily led, that they follow what they see because they don't have certainty of conviction themselves. Maybe that's part of maturity, right? It's coming to some beliefs you hold, and when you have those, you have an orientation. But when you don't have them, then you swing around based on the situations that you find yourself in. Gabrielle?
They lie a lot.
Okay, they're liars, too.
I should say pure-minded, not pure-minded.
Oh, pure-minded. Is that what it is? Yeah. You said pure-minded, not peer-minded?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to add that then. Peers matter. People all remember that from your own days in junior high, right? Peers matter, don't they? When you're that young. Yeah, Sarah, right.
And also, like, narrow-minded. They don't multitask, but they analyze one thing and then the next. Cross those two.
Okay, so there's like a narrowness. So anyway, I think that just thinking about the child and recognize, I think what it's important to recognize here is children aren't innocent, period, or evil, period, right? What you need to do is like think about it as an open question in a way, and then ask yourself, how does the novel answer that question? And then in talking about the novel, how do we answer the question about children? So these are some reflections. If you look at the keyword, one of the important things to note, I think, too, is right, the idea that children have some sort of family structure around them, whether that's an adopted family or some kind of foster home, or whether they're with their biological parents, whatever it might be. Kids have lots of different family structures around them, but we think of that family structure as, in the modern West at least, as being important emotionally, that there should be some sort of emotional support for the development of the child, and that child should have some sort of opportunity to undergo a period of development to maturity. And so for example, in this novel, one of the problems is that children that maturation process is somehow disrupted by the people imposing sexual experiences on them that don't fit into that process of maturation. Right? So part of that's one of the back ideas here in talking about children, right? And that, of course, that's not the way it necessarily was 300 years ago, where the family was an economic unit, right? Why do people have big families? Welfare program, right? You needed to have the kids in order to provide for the parents when they got older to make the farm work, et cetera, make the unit work, whatever it was going at the time, whatever sort of social context they found themselves in. And so the idea of the family as emotional is a relatively new one for us today. The other thing I wanted to mention here too, that just might give some helpful context for thinking about Scandinavian crime fiction and the child, I can sort of crystallize it with a question. Is it against the law to spank your child in any of the Nordic countries? Yes, it is. It's against the law. All 5 of them. Why do you think that is? Agnes?
I think it was Taylor, but someone touched upon the idea that you're imitating what you see.
Uh-huh.
Like if you're a child and you're influenced by viewing or kind of imagining these violent acts, you tend to have a possibility of kind of doing that.
Okay, so that maybe it's a legal a way to try to prevent violence in the society at large, to make illegal corporal punishment of children. I mean, the other thing is, it's kind of part of that whole welfare state thing where the state has a lot of influence on people's daily lives. And all these countries have had a very strong emphasis on the child, really for the last 30, 40 years. They certainly have similar histories in many countries where, that kind of corporal punishment, if you read history of literature, it's not that far away, where kids are getting, rulers on the hands and so forth. But really in the 70s, recognizing children's rights, and the UN, for example, passed the Charter of the Rights of the Child and things like that. These countries, especially Sweden in particular, but the others as well, quickly passed laws that increase protections for children to the point where there's a state office called the Ombudsman for Children, who's basically a neutral party that looks after, in any legislative context, the rights of children, right? To make sure that laws don't impinge on children and so forth. So super strong protections for kids in these countries. And then with that goes a whole legal sort of basket of rights and laws that aim to protect the child. So yeah, you're not sure people do, of course, but there's a very strong sort of sense of the rights of the child and the protections for the child as being central to the definition of those societies. So it's very interesting too. It sort of ripples out in a lot of ways. I noticed or found, for example, if you go to public bathrooms in a lot of these Nordic countries, there's always like kids' potties in there, right? Because like this idea of inclusion and thinking about the needs of children, right? So there's like a little trainer potty in there, whatever. At like some museum, especially places where kids congregate, museums and that kind of thing. So, and then all kinds of public taking into account of children. So the child is an interesting figure there that gets treated differently than maybe here. I don't know. That's another question, as sort of like culturally bound ideas of the child and how they vary from culture to culture to culture. People may, based on your own background, people may have had different experiences or different attitudes toward children that resonate culturally, right? Where when you're with someone from that sort of same cultural background, then you recognize that. So, for example, what's a good one? I'm just thinking of, my wife is Jewish, right? And so, like, the Jewish mother is a very famous figure, right? In the face of the kids and pushing and pulling and telling and wiping noses and whatever, and stuffing food in their mouths and so forth. That these things, resonate. There's all these stories, whatever. So, but every cultural every ethnic group, cultural group, we have these kinds of things that resonate with the way kids and parents relate to one of the way families work. And so that those cultural differences matter too. And in some ways, we can talk about the child in general terms, but then here we also have specifics too that are culturally or historically specific. Any other thoughts people want to just in kind of like unpacking this idea of the child a little bit here? First, are the things that you want to mention or questions or anything like that before we take a break? Okay, well, I think this is it's a good one to leave here and turn to the novel next. So let's take about a 10-minute break. We'll start a little before past and turn to our novel.